Good afternoon, everyone. We're just waiting on a few more attendees to join the webinar today, and we'll get starting in a couple of seconds. So good afternoon. My name is Jeanette James, and I am the BU National Advisor for Service Development with the Headspace Delivery team. I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for joining us and our session here today from your busy lives all across Australia. Today, I'm stepping in for Dr. Helen Butler, who is not able to present today as she's feeling unwell. Helen is sorry to be unable to participate, as this is an area of research and practice which she feels really passionate about. However, we are very fortunate to hear from wonderful panellists very soon. Some of you may have attended the first BU in Focus event in February, which opened the discussion about various types of transitions across different developmental stages and how these impact mental health and wellbeing. You can access a recording of this on the BU events page under the webinar recording section. So today's session will continue this initial exploration, focusing more particularly on the transition from primary to secondary schools. So another In Focus webinar will be held on the 30th of April, and it will be exploring what we can learn from everyday transitions in the early years to promote good mental health. For those of you who don't know too much about BU, it's a national mental health initiative led by Beyond Blue in partnership with Early Childhood Australia and Headspace. It is funded by the Australian Government, and BU offers educators and early learning communities a no-cost, evidence-based online professional learning, complemented by a range of tools and resources and events like this one today. BU includes a suicide prevention and response service. BU consultants are available across the nation to support early learning services, and schools embrace the BU approach. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and waters throughout Australia and pay respects to the elders, both past, present and future and emerging, and also particularly the educational elders that are joining us today. We recognise the importance of continued connection to culture and to land and country and community, to the health and the social wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Members of our panellists are joining us today from Melbourne, so the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and from Sydney, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So we are delighted to have many panellists who are able to share different perspectives on their transitional experiences. Dr. Lisa Monday, who you can see on the screen there, she might give us a little wave, from the CAT study, the Child to Adolescent Transition Study, will share current research evidence on young people during the transition years. Welcome, Lisa, and thanks for joining us today. Jodie Scanlon is a primary school educator and now a BU educational consultant with the Victorian team. Welcome, Jodie. And Mary Copeland, who is sitting with me in the Sydney office today, is the Community Liaison Officer and School Administration Officer at Arthur Phillip High School in New South Wales. A warm welcome to you, Mary. We will hear more from Lisa, Jodie and Mary soon, but for now, we're all going to switch off our webcams to ensure that the audio and the visual presentation is optimised during this webinar. We acknowledge the range of experience in the room today, and we understand that there are varying degrees of awareness, knowledge and practice experience of mental health in education. We do welcome observations and questions from all of you via the question and answer box that you'll be able to see on your screen. And on this platform, you'll also see a chat box, and if you select the drop-down selection that mentions or send questions to staff, we'll be able to collate your responses and we'll provide answers to you in a follow-up PDF. So your own wellbeing needs are a priority of BU. While you are putting your energy into creating a positive mentally healthy environment for children and young people, it's also important to focus on your wellbeing and that of your colleagues. There is a range of information and resources available on the BU website to help educators look after themselves while taking care of children and young people. We will provide links to our wellbeing tools and fact sheets in a post-webinar material. For those unfamiliar with GoToWebinar, this is what the screen will typically look like with the webinar viewer on the left and the control panel on the right. If you are experiencing difficulties at any time, please note the customer care number of 1800 136 402 on the screen to call for support directly. You might like to jot this down. You can ask questions about using GoToWebinar throughout the question box in the control panel as highlighted in red. And you can see here that the control panel you're able to manage your computer or your phone audio. And today you're in listen only mode. We do hope to respond to as many questions and queries that come in via the chat box or the Q&A box as possible during today's session. But for those that we don't get to, we'll follow up with supplementary material after the event concludes. All event participants will be able to access a certificate of participation, a recording of the webinar, and any other supplementary material. This will include any reflection questions that we invite you to consider during the webinar and contextualise within your own learning community. We also encourage you to have a go at the polls we'll be launching throughout this session. So we'll now launch our first poll to start reflecting on our collective experiences and involvement with coordinating primary to secondary school transitions. So as you can see here on the screen, the poll is open. What is your experience in the transition space? So if you wouldn't mind selecting one, and whilst we're waiting on the results of the poll, I'd like to mention here that you may also have access to transitional resources in your own educational sector, and we encourage you to explore what these are if you haven't done so already. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes for people to select one of those options: many years primary, many years secondary, or some experience are new to this space. And let's have a look at those results. So many people are joining us from many years secondary and some experience and new to this space, so a lovely range there. So we'll move on to the next slide now. We have learnt much over the years about transitional space, and gone are the days where transitioning students attending a solo orientation event have gone. So transition is usually more of an extended process, beginning in primary school and continuing into the early years of secondary school. So let's launch our second poll. What is your experience in the transitional space? And apologies, I think I may have swapped over the polls. So we might go to the first poll, which is our audiences today. So apologies for this, I'm just stepping in at the last minute and we'll maybe do our first poll. So the first poll is, what type of learning community are you joining us from? Are you joining us, are you a pre-service educator, an early learning service, a primary school, a secondary school, or other? And while we're completing that poll, we recognise that across Australia, states and territories have developed their own processes and resources to support transition. Until quite recently, the years of transition have differed from state to state. So in, I think, 2015, Western Australia made Year 7 the first year of secondary school, and South Australia is doing the same from 2022 with a pilot in 2020. So that's very exciting. For those of you in these states, there may be particular challenges for staff to consider in planning transition. And we may have a look at the results of that poll. And we have many people here from primary schools and 11% from secondary schools and 40% others. Thank you very much for participating in that poll. So our speakers will discuss some of the ways that schools and school staff and students themselves and families can contribute to making the most of transitional opportunities and meeting the challenges of transition. As mentioned in the previous BU webinar, it is important to try to bolster protective factors and, where possible, minimise risk factors in periods of transition. You can find this fact sheet and others on the BU website. Risk and protective factors operate across a number of contexts: the individual, their family, the school community, as well as social relationships. So transition from primary to secondary school often means multiple changes across multiple contexts. For some students, transition simply means moving to another part of their existing school, and for others, it can mean big changes in family and social relationships. So a sense of connectedness and belonging may be lost. While these changes can be positive and exciting, this can increase risk for some students. Transitions can therefore create opportunities as well as challenges, such as the loss of valued relationships, increased worry and distress, loss of confidence, fall in academic achievement, sometimes identity confusion or disconnection from school. So let's now hear from Dr. Lisa Monday, who will start sharing her she'll have control of the screen in a moment, and she'll be able to share some information about the CAT study. So the CAT study is the Child to Adolescent Transition Study, and how this relates to some transitional opportunities and challenges. So over to you, Lisa.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction, Jeanette. As Jeanette said, so my name's Lisa Mundy and I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Adolescent Health at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. And my background is in developmental psychology, and for the last 8 years I've been working on the Childhood to Adolescent Transition Study, and I'd like to share with you today some of our findings from that study. So, Okay, great. So first I'd like to talk about what's happening for students during this time. So if I ask you to think about when you think puberty begins, many people will say around 12 years of age. And that's when the physical changes begin for most children, although of course there's a wide range of onset of puberty. That process we now know is gonadotrophy. And we used to think that puberty was a unitary event that was kind of pretty much characterized by those physical changes. But we now understand that puberty is actually a cascade of hormonal changes. And those hormonal changes actually start many years before those first physical signs. So the first hormonal cascade in puberty is something that we call adrenarche. And this results in hormones called adrenal androgens that start rising around 8 years of age, and they continue rising right through late childhood, across adolescence and into our early 20s, where they plateau and then they decline in older age. The third process that makes up puberty is the growth spurt, and that begins around 12 years of age for girls and about a year later for boys. And obviously that brings with it big physical changes in terms of growth and body structure and size. And of course, within the middle of all of these huge biological changes, we have the transition to high school. And now thinking about what's happening in the brain, we used to think similarly that sort of by the time we reached 7 years of age, that was when the brain pretty much stopped developing. And that's because that's when the brain reaches full adult, around the age that the brain reaches full adult size. But with improvements in imaging technology, with the introduction of MRI machines and so on, we can now see inside the brain, and we realize that these late childhood years into adolescence are actually a really critical phase of development, and actually they're probably the second biggest change in the postnatal life. So if you're looking at this slide, you might be thinking, well, it looks like we've got lots of colors moving to fewer colors across across the ages from childhood into young adulthood. And so that you might be thinking, well, that looks like less good development. But actually what those slides are showing is the grey matter of the brain. And the grey matter contains the cells and connections between the cells, which are called synapses. And during this phase, we have a process called synaptic pruning. And what's happening there is the connections between the cells that we use a lot are strengthened, and those that we don't use so much are pruned away or removed. And this is a really, really important developmental process, and it importantly is dependent on the environment as well, which makes this period of life such a flexible and time of life. And we also know that those pubertal changes that I was talking about play a role in organizing and activating the changes that happen in the brain across this time. And during this time as well, we know that unfortunately it's when many mental health problems begin. So by 14 years of age, 1/2 of all mental health problems have emerged. And for many children, and these problems will continue to persist through adolescence and into adulthood. But importantly, the symptoms of these problems are emerging during these late primary school years as well. So despite this being a really important phase of development and lots of changes happening, this has actually been a pretty neglected area of life within policy and research. And really, yeah, that things sort of, I guess it's been highlighted really by the, in Victoria, and back in 2015, the Victorian Auditor General highlighted that when looking at education transitions, there was a lot of good evidence and good practice happening to support children with the transition from into primary school, but the same wasn't true for the transition into secondary school. And as a result, we weren't seeing the same sorts of outcomes for children across that transition. So we set up the CAT study in 2012 to really try and characterise what was going on for children and their families and their schools across these years. So in 2012, we recruited just over 1,200 students to take part. They were in Victoria, primarily in Melbourne, and so they were in grade 3, and they were 8 to 9 years of age during that time. So we followed those students for the last 7 years across those late primary school years into secondary school, and we're just planning the 8th wave of data collection when students will be in year 10. But today I want to talk to you about those primary school years and that transition into secondary school and what the students, teachers and parents have been telling us about that time. Okay. So firstly, I thought I'd show you some data that we've collected looking at those earliest hormonal changes that were happening around 8 years of age. So on this slide, we were looking at those adrenal androgens that started rising, and we were looking at how that related to children's mental health. And what we found is that for children who had higher levels of these hormones, particularly for boys, they had higher levels of behaviour and peer problems during this time of life. So this really indicates that this is potentially, these years are a really important time in terms of intervening to try and prevent the onset of these mental health problems. We've also been really fortunate in that we've been able to look at inside the brains of 100 children who were taking part in CATs, and this was our nested study, iCATs. And similarly here, we looked at children who had higher levels of those adrenal hormones comparing with their peers, and we found that there were differences in the way that the brain responded to emotional stimuli between those children with higher levels of hormones compared with lower levels. Now I thought I'd show you the mental health symptoms of the children taking part across these from grades 3 into 7, so across the late primary school into high school. Now it's important here for me just to highlight that this is mental health symptoms, so we're not looking at a diagnosed disorder here. This is just elevated symptoms that the students themselves are reporting. And there's two main things I think are important to note here. One, we start to see an increase in mental health symptoms as we move into those final years of primary school and into secondary school. The other important thing I think that we're also seeing here is that we start to see these gender differences emerging. So you can see that girls start to have higher levels of mental health problems compared with their peers across this age. And this is most likely linked with the changes that we're seeing in those pubertal hormones that are happening across this age. And I guess just to highlight really that by year 7, 1 in 5 girls are reporting high levels of mental health problems. So it's a fairly large chunk of the class that teachers are seeing will be dealing with these issues. Okay, and so we then looked at how those mental health problems during primary school were linked with academic performance in year 7, and we were looking at children who had persistent mental health problems during primary school. So they were reporting having higher levels of problems at 2 or more years during primary school. And what we found was that children who had higher levels of these problems across these years, by the time they got to year 7, they were almost a year behind their peers. And it's probably important to note that we were also controlling for their prior academic performance at this age as well. So this is a fairly substantial lag at this point in education. Interestingly, for reading, it was a bit less, but still around a half of a year lag by the time they reached year 7. Now I thought I'd show you some data looking at peer problems. So we looked at different types of bullying that students experienced across these years. And you can see that in primary school, there's quite high levels of frequent bullying. So this is being bullied at least once a week. So you can see around 1 in 4 students were reporting experiencing frequent bullying during this time. Overall, there was a decline in bullying across these years. That's a really positive take-home message. But if we look at those top 2 slides, the decline is probably most pronounced in those 2 slides, the being frequently teased and being physically hurt. And they're the types of behaviours that boys tend to be involved in more. Whereas if we look at the bottom 2 slides being talked about behind their backs or excluding others, these are the types of behaviours that girls typically engage in more. And you can see here that there's not such a decline across the transition. So thinking about the differences in the different types of bullying that are occurring across this age range, and also the gender differences that we're seeing. We also looked at this in relation to their academic performance in year 7 as well, and found similarly that those children experiencing high levels of bullying during primary school were again around a year behind their peers in secondary school. So we also asked students about their concerns about the transition, and we asked this across lots of different areas in year 6 and again in year 7. And you can see that generally across the board there were quite high concerns across a whole range of things. The top 3 concerns in year 6 were around homework, losing old friends, and getting lost. And I guess I just wanted to draw attention to these, as these are things that we could be doing to start building the capabilities of students during those mid to late primary school years to help them deal with their concerns that they might be having, particularly around how to deal with the changes in homework as they transition and in terms of getting lost. And we'll hear more about that later on. As I mentioned, we also asked these questions in year 7 as well. And I think one of the things to look at here is that generally there wasn't actually that much of a decline. So the students still had pretty high levels of concern around most of these things, even when they were in year 7. And interestingly, when we looked at discipline and detentions, this actually there was actually a small increase as well. So I guess new things to be worried about that perhaps hadn't been evident before. So we also asked teachers to rate their students on a really simple 4-item questionnaire. And this asked about how they thought the students would go across 4 different areas. And we asked this in year 6 for all the students and the parents to complete. And you can see the areas there on the slide. You can see on this next slide that generally that on the whole, teachers felt that boys possibly were going to struggle more, particularly with the academic life in high school. And interestingly, what we found is that these 4 items that we asked teachers in Year 6 predicted how well those students performed on their NAT plan in Year 7, even controlling for their performance in Year 5, so previously while they were in primary school. Interestingly, teachers were actually much better at this than parents, so parents weren't as good at predicting academic performance across the transition. So teachers are obviously playing a really important role in understanding what's going on. I just want to finish up now by just talking about some interviews that we conducted with primary schools around the strategies that they were using to support students in the transition. So we conducted these interviews with 50 schools who were all taking part in CATS, and we looked at the strategies they were using across 3 areas, so administrative and information, social and personal, and teaching and learning. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of the key findings that we found to conclude. So looking at organisation and administration, here I guess one of the key take-home messages is less than 50% of primary schools had a written policy around the transition. But also, most schools had meetings with their secondary schools, but only about 20% of primary schools were able to meet with all of their destination secondary schools. So there's obviously quite a few students who wouldn't necessarily be getting the advantage of having their teachers being able to connect with their destination high schools. Social and personal factors is generally where schools are doing really well, and there's lots happening here. I guess just to draw attention to the buddy system, where there's some evidence here that this is actually really helpful of supporting students across the transition, but only around 10% of schools were implementing this. And finally, curriculum and pedagogy. So this is an area where there's less research, and that translates, I think, into there being less resources for schools to be able to draw on. But you can see here that generally schools weren't implementing these to such a high level. So only around 1 in 4 schools were implementing timetable changes, and about 60% were implementing homework changes. And as the other thing as well is that these were typically happening towards the end of the transition period, so sort of later on in Year 6. So I guess I just want to finish off by just saying that this is a rapid phase of development. It's been described as a sensitive phase of development and a developmental switch point. And it is a period of vulnerability for those reasons that I outlined before. So there are increased risk of mental health problems, disengagement from school, and so on. But the fact that this is also such a rapid period of development means that it's also a time for opportunity, a sort of great opportunity for us to really be able to support students and help to move them onto better tracks, or to keep them on traveling along on the great tracks that they're already on. So I just want to finish off by just thanking all the fantastic schools and students and parents that have been taking part with us, and also all the brilliant research team and our investigators and funders as well, and NCRI as well. Thanks so much.
Lisa, that is amazing. 50 schools participating in your team's research. What fantastic dedication. There's certainly a hunger for this information, isn't there? You've given us a lot to think about, and that we can use your team's research to inform our practice as educators. And we're really thrilled that you were able to share your team's research with us today. It's so pertinent to this webinar, so thank you very much. Before we move to our next panelist, you may like to jot down some wonderings from Lisa's presentation. So how can you use the information that Lisa presented in the primary to secondary school transitional space back in your own school settings? So we will share with you a PDF of the questions raised by Lisa so that you don't need to write these down. And in addition, we have also included other reflective questions that you may like to revisit with your action team or your leadership teams back in your learning community settings. So in your panel, or your dashboard, you will be able to see next to the questions and the polls a little tab that says handout. So if you click on that handout, you'll be able to right click and download the PDF. Alternatively, we can share this with you in the post webinar material. So you see some questions there on the screen, and you may like to pause for a second and jot down some wonderings. So our next speaker is Jodie Scanlon, and she will take us on a journey through her transitional experiences in the primary setting. Thanks very much, Jodie. Over to you.
Thanks, Jeanette. And thank you, Lisa, for such an excellent presentation. That was very thought-provoking. And it was wonderful to see so much crossover with what schools should be doing and what I know many schools are doing. My name's Jodie Scanlon and I'm an education consultant on the BU Victorian team. My background is teaching, as I completed a double degree in arts and education prep to 12. I briefly taught in secondary schools at the beginning of my career and then went on to teach in primary settings for 8 years. In my primary role, I was transition coordinator for 5 years and wellbeing leader for 3 years. So I'm just going to share today some of the things that we did while I was leading transition and what things were helpful. So during my time facilitating transitions, first and foremost, we found to firstly develop a 12-month plan and to document the plan. This should be shared with your local secondary settings as well as with students and families. And we found it helpful to incorporate student voice when drafting these. Asking students what they found or that they would find helpful and supportive was really surprising and a really powerful and valuable tool. Also arranging visits with local secondary settings. Even if it was not the school that the student would be attending, it was great to walk through the grounds and visit lockers and science rooms and theatres. Preparing students visually for a new environment is crucial, as they may feel scared to ask what these unfamiliar settings are, such as what is a science lab and what is it used for. So it was really beneficial to have open discussions while wandering around a new setting. The sheer difference in size of the school can be overwhelming if it's unexpected, so the more exposure for students, the better. We used to invite past students to return to give a presentation on a day in the life of a Year 7, and this was always a really lovely experience, as it was exciting for the past student to return, and the talks were always so positive and encouraging for our Year 6 students. The past student would excite the Year 6s with musings around camps and excursions, new friends, larger libraries, sport activities, your own locker, etc. We would link in with local primary schools and run transition days. So we aimed for ideally once a term, and these would be centred around sport activities, leadership days, discos, etc. We also regularly practiced practical tools such as reading maps and reading bus times tables. We walked to the local bus stop and train station just to expose the students to these different modes of transport. We focused explicit teaching around time management and organisational skills, specifically knowing which equipment would be appropriate for which lesson and estimating time. We tried to facilitate discussions and activities promoting positive self-esteem and a sense of belonging in a new environment, which is really important. And then just regular communication with parents and with our secondary settings regarding transition activities and the importance of these. So keeping those lines of communication open at all times. So for primary schools and secondary schools working together, sharing your plan over an extended period is important. So knowing what's happening in each setting will support a smoother transition, and developing relationships with a goal of the Year 6 students attending events. So when I was transition leader, we were invited to, and I would request to attend events at local secondary schools. For example, matinee theatre performances, art shows, sport days. And the secondary schools would sometimes use it as a leadership opportunity for their older students to plan and run activities for our younger students, which was always really wonderful. We would share correspondence with parents regarding transition information and always making sure that they knew what to expect. And we would discuss ways to ensure that the students understood and had full access to mental health support in their new school, keeping in mind that some students and families will require more support than others. We would ensure that there was a thorough handover process, and this would include exchanging information relating to behaviour, strengths, areas for improvement, significant friendships, family history, and then any additional needs or areas for support, and ensure that there is a shared planning for multiple orientation days for students. So in addition to the orientation days, we would always ensure or encourage a day for special needs students, which was really beneficial. We always found it really important to try and support families as well. So supporting a family is an important element of transition, so encouraging carers to maintain the open communication with the young person regarding the importance of embracing change and the challenging feelings that they may be experiencing, and then maintain open communication with primary and secondary settings, and highlighting to parents the importance of attending any transition meetings and keeping up with correspondence. We did find that sometimes parents would feel much more comfortable communicating with the primary school, as that's what's been familiar to them for a long time. So it is important that the primary schools are aware of what's happening in the secondary schools around transition so they can field any questions. And then encouraging families to regularly practice new routines with their young person, such as catching the bus, selecting appropriate equipment for a lesson, independently navigating a library, and new walking routines, etc. We would remind families to be mindful of technology and sleep habits for the young person. And then lastly, encouraging parents and carers to openly discuss their own experiences and successes around change, validating any feelings of fear or discomfort for the young person, as transition can be a really challenging time in a young person's life. So it's really important to keep those lines of communication open and ensure that there's lots of support. Well, that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand you back to Jeanette.
Thanks so much, Jodie. It was fabulous to hear how your school incorporated student voice. I love that. And I also love the fact that you noticed there is a significant visual change for many students. Actually experiencing the different modes of transport is a really great idea as well. So thanks for sharing with us today, Jodie. I'm now going to welcome Mary Copeland, who is the Community Liaison Officer for Arthur Phillip High School in Parramatta, New South Wales.
Thanks, Jeanette. Lisa, I love that great research and data. I'm certainly going to use some of that for my presentations in the future. Jodie, it's great to have a primary school relationship with the high schools. That's the initial part of transition. Thanks, Jeanette. I'm pleased to be sharing with you and representing Arthur Phillip High School today. I'm the Community Liaison Officer at Arthur Phillip High School, and I'm responsible for Year 6 and Year 7 transition and the enrolment process. I've been in an admin role for 8 years at Arthur Phillip High School. Arthur Phillip High School is a wonderful school, and I adore the learning community. I especially love watching children grow from primary school students into young people. The school was established in 1875 and is considered a city school located right in the heart of Parramatta Business CBD and educational precinct. The school population is diverse with about 84 different nationalities, and we gather our students from 30 primary schools. We currently have 1,000 students, but in 2020, we are moving out to our new build to accommodate 2,000. You can see the picture of our 17-story high-rise future-focused school on the slide. Before I joined Arthur Phillip High School as enrolment officer, there was no Year 6-7 transition program in place. I'm pleased to accept the role as Community Liaison Officer and build a plan for effective transition from primary to secondary school. As a team, we are still refining this and learning from others. At the moment, the team consists of a Stage 4 deputy, current year advisor, next year's year advisor, head teacher, and myself. I'd like to share some of the strategies we use, and I'll finish the presentation with a timeline showing an overview of our transition processes. Survivor Day. What a great day, heaps of fun. This is an example of one of our events. The kids love it. This is a good day for both student and staff, as it's designed to be a casual day, even though it's structured. Kids appreciate the style of learning, it's hands-on. The day is open to everyone. Last year we had about 300 students participate. This event occurs in Term 2 with Year 6 and includes Stage 4 teachers. We invite the Year 5 and 6 teachers from the primary schools to attend and observe the day. From this, we gain lots of data and we find our potential student leaders. We use project-based learning and the STEM programs on this day. I just want to point out what STRIVE stands for in Arthur Phillip High School. STRIVE are our core values: respect, success, and responsibility. We use these rules every day: home, away, school, or play. We hold orientation day in term 2, On this day, we run a pentathlon, and I'll show that you in the next slide. We used to run our testing day on the same day as orientation day, but the kids didn't enjoy it. They were too focused on the testing aspect. We found combining the testing and orientation day was not successful. We made a decision to separate the two, and it's been beneficial. Students now come to the day excited to be part of a fun-filled action day. The feedback has been great, and they feel as though they're less anxious about orientation, and they've already established relationships with teachers, peers, and others, and are familiar with the school's environment. And next one is the pentathlon. This is one of our fabulous events that we run on orientation day. Every child competes. The main purpose of this day is to continue building community and a solid sense of belonging. We know a sense of belonging is important for a successful transition and eases the students concerned about changing schools and community. Collaborating by works in groups is an important skill for life and in school. The pentathlon also highlights the importance of time management, school, and critical thinking, all important skills for a secondary school young person. The last slide is my timeline. I've divided this into 4 groups of each term. It's highlighted a few of them for you today. The pentathlon, the orientation day, and survivor day. The Year 6 taster day is also popular. That's when we go out to the primary schools. You can see that we ensure families are a significant component of our transition program. We find kids don't ask as many questions as the parents do. This is important that families can continue their supportive conversations around the strength-based approach to transition conversations at home. We provide them with tips on information evenings, provide them parent packages with a calendar, important school information regarding subject choices, gifted and talented program, how to get to school, what to wear. We found that when we support the parents, we can still fill out the expression of interest forms for them, their enrolment forms, and any other forms we can assist them with, as long as we keep that communication open. Our transition program is still very young. It only started 2 years ago, and we will continue to evolve it for the benefits of our students and the staff and their families. Come to the next slide. Thank you. It's to ensure a seamless and smooth transition period. Transitions can be successful and thoughtful with thoughtful planning and ensuring you respond to the challenges that arise. There are many opportunities to build this transition program. I'd just like to add that finally, I'd just like to say thank you to have this opportunity to put Arthur Phillip High School. What Arthur Phillip is doing for transition in primary school. But can I just say that all New South Wales government schools are doing great things. And if there is no program in place for you and your school, start creating one. Maybe something you've heard today may help you. But don't get discouraged. Remember, what works at one school may not work in another. Find out what your student needs, what they are, and what the resources are available to you. Listen to your community, research your data. Do some groundwork. Just remember, high school can be a very, very challenging, but not so much hard or scary. But just look at my children's happy faces. Thank you again for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'd love to come next year or even this year to have a look at the pentathlon day and that survivor day. That sounds very exciting. I'm sure some of the BU staff would like to attend with me. So thank you so much for Mary and Jody, and also Lisa, for highlighting research and on the importance of primary and secondary schools working together over an extended period and the importance of students and families being connected. Another useful tool that we have seen used nationally and internationally is the idea of a transition passport. Passport. You may have heard of it. Ideally, they are started in primary school and completed in secondary school. The transition passports contain a range of activities that support transition and include family and student voice in this space, such as what the student feels the school should know about them. We can provide examples of these in a post-webinar material. So we do have a couple of question and answers that have come through the chat box, and I'll ask some of the panelists if the questions are relevant to them to unmute their microphone. So we have heard from both research and practice in this setting, in the transitional space. Whilst we're answering some questions, you might like to think about your school and what are the current supports available to implement some of these ideas and what your school can do to build upon this work effectively. So if we move to the next slide, and Lisa, a question has come in from you from the attendees. Someone has asked, it would be great for schools not here today to be able to learn more about this research. Can we share the research with them, and can they join the study?
Hi. Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And yes, we're definitely really keen for all schools to hear about our research. So we have a website which we can include as part of the resources at the end of this webinar, and also we have a social media accounts as well, so we can also share those as well, and so we keep regular updates there. And there's also links there to the reports that we've done, which summarize quite a lot of the data I've been talking about today that we've done with the Departments of Education. Yeah, so I think that hopefully that between those resources that we can certainly make sure that they're accessible to others.
Thank you so much, Lisa. If anyone else has any questions, you might like to pop those either in the chat box and reply to the staff, or just Q&A box, and we will mention either in the webinar today, or we'll collate those responses for you in a PDF that we'll make available on the webinar section of the events page on the BE website. So the next slide shows some key learnings from our webinar today. We've heard that it's important, and we've heard some great up-to-date research that is evidence-based and discussed implications for practice. We have heard from primary and secondary school staff about strategies that have worked well in their own transition programs. We hope that you've taken some key learnings from today that you can share with your learning community to support children and young people through transitions. We encourage you to check out the BU website, specifically the professional learning and the fact sheets provided information about transitions. So as we draw our webinar to a close, let's consider some next steps. We do know that registering your school or early learning service is the best way to enhance whole school setting approach to promoting children's and young people's mental health by embracing the BU approach. There are so many benefits in registering as a BU learning community and assigning an action team leader. This includes gaining access to a dedicated and expert BU consultant to support you. It includes surveys and tools and resources that are not available to an individual account holder. Your BU consultant can act as a critical friend and take a strength-based approach, helping identify what your community is already doing and how BU can support your existing work and planning priorities. And please don't forget, this is available all at no cost, and we have BU consultants all around the nation. If you're unsure if your school is a participating BU school, you can contact your local consultant via the BU website, and we will get in contact with you and make those connections for you. So many thanks for joining us this afternoon to discuss the important topic of school transitions. And we're just moving on to the last couple of slides now. When you exit out of this webinar by closing the web browser, you'll be prompted to complete a short 5-question survey. This helps us know what you have liked, what we can improve on, and how we can best meet your needs in the future. We will be offering a variety of in-focus webinars all throughout the year. The survey will also be sent to you via email if you don't see it on exiting the webinar. Also included in the survey are some reflection questions asking you to consider your learnings from today and an action that you can take straight away to help support the children and young people in your care managed transitions. We encourage you to explore our in-focus webinars and national check-in events. We hope to see you again next time, but until then, take care and thank you for working with us to grow a mentally healthy generation.